Hello everyone, I hope you are all keeping well, inshallah. Welcome to this first video lecture in your civilization course for this third year. Today we are dealing with another offspring of King Henry VIII, namely Mary Tudor, Mary the First, or as she was known in history as Bloody Mary. Mary Tudor was born in 1516 to King Henry VIII and Queen Catherine of Aragon. She was known to be healthy and beautiful, and she was the only surviving child because her mother witnessed many miscarriages. Yet, Mary was seen as a disappointment. Mary was considered a disappointment because she was a female, and to her father she was not able to rule. She was beautiful, she was healthy, and he obviously loved her, but she wasn't satisfying enough, as she didn't represent for him the next or future male heir. And in spite of all that, she was treated as a Tudor princess. She was highly privileged and favored by her father, and he was clever enough to use her as a maneuvering force to control his allies. In spite of being a female, Mary the First, or Mary Tudor, was to a greater extent precious to her father because she could be used as a bargaining element between Henry and the other monarchs. For example, there was a kind of an Anglo-French treaty embracing the wider settlements and containing a kind of provision or agreement for Mary Tudor in order for her to be betrothed to the Dauphin of France. And she was engaged to the French king at the age of 4. After some time, and because of Henry VIII's mistemper, there was a kind of an abrogation of the treaty. So Mary was newly promised to the 20-year-old emperor just to protect her father's interests around Europe. Mary Tudor was highly favored by her father. He has assigned for her a mini household or a modest establishment, which was a small castle where she could rule for herself. Of course, the establishment included servants and advisors, and she had the chance to rule as a de facto queen. De facto queen in this concept means a queen in practice. Mary could practice her role as a Tudor princess and as a future Tudor queen at a very young age. As for her education, her mother Catherine of Aragon assumed full responsibility to supervise her daughter's first steps in literacy, and she taught her Latin, English, French, and Spanish, and the princess was clever enough to learn dancing and music fast, and Added to that, she was able to learn rhetoric and the art of persuasion. Of course, rhetoric is the way of manipulating language and using language artistically. And the talent of persuading people helped her to easily convince and affect people through her speech. This is one of the things that King Henry used wisely, because he knew that her talent of the poetic speech and language will help him gain allies in order to choose her as a future queen for them. And in spite of all that humanist education and humanist qualities that she possessed, she was still raised and nurtured as a devout Catholic. Unfortunately for Mary, her magical life and dreams were stopped dead in their tracks. At a certain point in her life, everything was transformed and turned upside down for her and her mother, and from being a royal princess, she has survived a sad Cinderella story. By the age of 9, Mary was groomed and destined to inherit the English throne. Her father, King Henry VIII, was eventually convinced that his Spanish queen will never be able to provide him with the male heir. So Mary was taught to act and be the future Queen of England, and she intended to serve to the best of her own ability, similar to the saintly monarchs. But in 1525, her tour of duty as a princess came into an end. Her father, King Henry VIII, started to ill-treat her, and she knew that he was dissatisfied with her because of her gender, and also because he started feeling tired of her mother. In July 1527, Henry declared that he and Catherine had never been properly married, because of course she was his brother's widow, so any compromise or amicable arrangement for him were impossible, and the only thing that the Pope could do was to annul the marriage. Also, and unfortunately for Mary and her mother, Henry had just quarrelled violently with the Emperor Charles, who was Catherine's nephew and the promised husband to her daughter, Mary Tudor. Mary was aware of the situations, and she was greatly disapproved by her father's whimsy actions to divorce her mother and marry Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn came into the scene by 1520, and she was the one convincing Henry to start and rebel against the Catholic faith, starting a Protestant religion, and also to ask the Roman Pope for divorce for the first time in the history of Europe. At a very tender age, Mary received the shocking truth that affected her personality later as an adult. Because she was in disfavor with her father's actions, especially when divorcing her mother and Anglicizing the English Church, she was illegitimized for no reason after being considered the future queen-to-be. And also, what added salt to injury is that she was forcibly separated from her mother as an act of punishment because she refused to accept the fact that her mother's marriage to her father was declared void. She was obliged to admit that her father, the king, was the supreme head of the English Church. She was ill-treated, harassed and beaten because of her beliefs, and by the time her half-sister Princess Elizabeth was born in 1533, she was forced to become her servant, performing household chores. This is why I like to read this story of Princess Mary Tudor as a sad Cinderella story. In January 1536, Queen Catherine of Aragon died without being able to see her daughter. Henry refused to allow Mary to meet her mother as a way to punish her for denying her supremacy, his supremacy of the English Church. In her youth, Mary was illegitimized by her father along with her half-sister Elizabeth because he believed that his only child was Edward. And then Edward died in 1553, ignoring his sister and his father's act of succession. He instead crowned Lady Jane Grey to be the new Protestant queen, as he was in conflict with his elder sister and because he was afraid that she would restore the old faith back. So this illegitimized monarch led a rebellion to London to claim the throne back, and she was the first female queen to rule in the history of England. After claiming her legal right to the throne, Mary was determined to make her dreams realize. She wanted to show herself as a pious queen, a devoted monarch, and a loving wife and mother. She has decided to marry a Spanish prince to ignite her maternal and ancestral Spanish heritage and prove her loyalty to the Roman Church. For the English people, Mary Tudor was known to be more Spanish than English, and the idea of marrying a foreigner was difficult for the English people, who were known to be aloof, to accept this. So even that people were rejoiced and happy that a Tudor queen came into the throne, some trouble started to appear, especially in Kent. A man with the name of Sir Thomas Wyatt, Jr., had led a rebellion to London, hoping that he would dethrone the Queen. Allegedly, this Thomas Wyatt had a plan of uncrowning Mary and her king consort, but unfortunately the rebellion didn't last long, as he was captured, trialed, and then executed. Thomas Wyatt's primary aim was to prevent the Queen from marrying a foreigner, but he had other secondary goals. He wanted to replace Mary the Catholic by her half-sister Elizabeth, hoping that she would change the social, political, religious and economic lives, as the country was already running down because of the state grievances or injustice, and he wanted to give right and speak for certain nobles who were marginalized during Edward and Mary's first reigns. In spite of everything that happened, Philip and Mary were formally espoused in 1554. For one time, Mary reflected on the fact that God had been good to her, and that she had successfully beaten all the odds of her being illegitimate or a spinster. Mary and Philip decided to get married after their one-time meeting. In other words, they have only met and slightly spoken on the spot, and then decided to marry the next day. As for Mary, She was obviously in love, because for her Prince Philip's charming character was a good match due to his noble birth and international might. Maybe she was desperate. She was already aging, and she was in need of a husband, and she had lower opportunities to have a child. As for Philip himself, he was 11 years younger, so I believe that he accepted to marry her because he was interested in the area. The country now was Catholicized. Spain and England have become allies due to this marriage. For the first time after many years, Mary I was thrilled. She was very happy with this alliance because she was deeply and passionately in love with Philip. For her, Philip of Spain was the man she could love, cherish, and respect, hoping that he would do the same. She needed a man in her life, a husband that will share her burdens with her and hopefully beget her a child. The English, on the other side of things, were not yet acclimatized with the fact of women on the throne, let alone marrying a foreigner. She was Catholic, and most of them were fine by that because most of the people were hiding their true faith. But the malaise was on the side of marrying a Spanish prince, a foreigner hovering over the British crown. Similar to her father, Mary I was kind of possessed with the idea of her securing the realm with a male heir. There have been some rumors in November of that same year, 1554, about the Queen's pregnancy. And people were partially rejoiced because for them any child born to the sovereigns would be 3/4 Spanish by blood. Yet, after a few months, Mary's pregnancy was proven a phantom pregnancy. She was devastated and embarrassed because it was not easy to confront this in front of England, Spain, and the entire Christendom. Queen Mary was disappointed because she couldn't provide a future male heir for the realm. She started a counter-reformation in order to occupy herself, or as it was known, a Catholic Reformation. And because she was ruined and destroyed, she began retaliating at herself and her people. The country's domestic affairs were in degradation as she and her Cardinal Pole were dragging the country into decadence. So instead of representing herself as a 16th century modernist queen, she only manifested in portraying a posthumous period of medieval life, or in other words, retrieving a dead period in the history of medieval decay. Of course, history gives her credit for good things that she's done for the Catholic Church. From the moment she ruled as a queen, she considered it to be her prime duty and obligation to act as a loyal servant to God and restore the old faith through beautifying the churches and the shrines for worship. So, as a loyal servant, she worked hard to amend what was broken and torn by her brother. She also funded great sums of money to restore the churches and celebrate the true faith through worship, music, and architecture. The Bloody Mary myth. I believe that one thing that Mary has inherited from her father was his bad reputation and mistemper. Similarly, as he was remembered only for his 6 marriages, she was remembered by her thirst to burn people alive at the stake, in spite of the fact that they both attempted to do great things during their reigns. The only thing that could be assessed in the Marian regime is burning 280 Protestants, men and women, in just under 4 years. One shouldn't be surprised at this because Mary I was the granddaughter of one of the most notorious queens in the history of Europe, namely Isabella of Castile, the woman responsible for burning and torturing both Muslims and Jews when she first stepped foot in Islamic Spain back in 1492, and also the niece of Juana la Loca or Joanna the Mad, who was famous for her melancholic nature and fits of anger. But for Mary, this shouldn't have been the case, because she was expected to represent a 16th century product of the humanist, modernized queen, and a good Christian princess who was well educated to exercise power as a Tudor monarch and not misuse her throne to contaminate the realm with medieval primitiveness and barbaric behavior. During her reign, England exercised the most intense religious persecution of its kind anywhere in the 16th century Europe, and her regime proved its negativity and short-sightedness as well as her instinct for self-destruction. And now, where was the husband in all of that? Of course, the relationship governing Mary I and Philip of Spain was practically political, because he has married her for his country's interests. Unfortunately for him, her father, the late King Henry VIII, has sterilized any power for his daughter's husbands not to become kings. In other words, he could only stand as a king consort, that is, the husband of the queen. And because of that, he decided to go and settle in Spain after his father's death in order to be the new crowned king there. For the most of her period of reign, Mary I was alone, and because she was desperate and convinced that she couldn't give him the child to secure the Catholic faith, he has only visited her once before she died, and he decided to step back and never interfere in the matter of England. In the later years of her reign, Mary I was ailing. She was dying as she was diagnosed with cancer. Of course, she was lonely, and for most of the people, she was seen as a psychopath. Maybe we cannot blame her regarding the psychological traumas she bore during her life. She didn't have a very happy childhood. Her father hated her. She was illegitimized, and her mother died without being able to see her. For most of us, we can feel her pain as she was marginalized. The only thing she could give back was her grudge and loathing for the Protestant faith. And maybe the way hatred consumed her led her to commit atrocious mass massacres during her period of reign. She found the only solace in the cries and sighs and the smell of the burning fat of the heretics, as she called them. Maybe it was the only thing to comfort her and smother the fire that was feeding of her spirit for years. The poor Mary Tudor died in 1558, and she was succeeded by the sister she never loved nor trusted, and who would receive England back to the Protestant faith. In history she was known as Bloody Mary, but maybe if she is humanized enough and read from the perspective of a human being who was really suffering, we could understand her pain and maybe never blame her for the horrible things she committed. This is all for now, dear students. I hope you find this useful. I'll be seeing you inshallah in another video. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comment section below and I'll be glad to answer back. Salam.